This is the moment the most powerful military in human history killed a classroom full of little girls and then blamed the country it was bombing for doing it. Picture the Shajareh Tayyebeh Elementary School in the southern Iranian town of Minab on the morning of February 28, 2026. It is a two-story building painted on its outer walls with pink flowers and green leaves. It is the kind of building that announces itself as a place for children before you even read the sign. It was a Monday, around 10 a.m. The children were in their seats. The first wave of U.S.-Israeli airstrikes had just begun somewhere in the distance, and parents were texting each other in panic, calling the school, telling teachers to send the children home. There was not enough time. At 10:17 a.m. local time, Monday, February 28, 2026, a Tomahawk cruise missile dove almost vertically out of the sky and struck the school compound. The black cruciform wings and small tail fins were captured on video, frame by frame, in footage that weapons experts at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, and Armament Research Services would all independently examine and reach the same conclusion about within days. It was a US Navy Tomahawk. There is no other country in this conflict that fires them. At least 175 people were killed. The majority of them were girls between the ages of 7 and 12. The image of one bespectacled young boy waving goodbye to his mother as she dropped him off that morning went viral within 48 hours and has not left the internet since. The head of Iran's Red Crescent, Pir Hossein Kolavand, stood at the site and said the attack had no comparison with any other incident, even in Gaza, as a singular event of mass child death in a single strike. Within 72 hours, U.S. President Donald Trump stood before cameras and said, "Based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran." When pressed, he added that Tomahawks are very generic and that Iran also has some Tomahawks. Iran does not have Tomahawks. Iran has never had Tomahawks. Iran cannot fire Tomahawks. Every single weapons expert on Earth knows this. And Trump said it anyway. In this deep dive, we are going to show you what the Pentagon's own preliminary investigation actually found about who killed those children. We are going to expose what Pete Hegseth dismantled inside the Defense Department before the first bomb fell that made this strike possible. We are going to reveal what former officials and 41 U.S. senators are now demanding that the White House refuses to answer. And we are going to confront the legal verdict that over 100 international law experts, including some of the most respected names at Yale, NYU, and Human Rights Watch, have already reached in writing. Trump did not just blame Iran. He told a provable lie about the deaths of over 100 children. And the system built to prevent exactly this kind of killing had been deliberately taken apart before the war began. To understand how 175 people were killed in a school on the first morning of a war, you have to understand what was dismantled in the 9 months before that morning arrived. In September 2025, Pete Hegseth stood in the Oval Office and announced a new operating philosophy for the United States military. He called it maximum lethality, not tepid legality. At Quantico, speaking to general and flag officers, he announced the end of what he called the woke military and dismissed stupid and overbearing rules of engagement. He said he intended to untie the hands of our warfighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country. These were not off-the-cuff remarks. They were policy statements delivered to the senior military leadership of the most powerful armed force on Earth. What followed those statements was a systematic dismantling of the institutional architecture that the United States military had spent years building after painful lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, two wars that produced their own devastating civilian casualty scandals and congressional investigations. Hegseth slashed the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence workforce by approximately 90%. He cut the U.S. Central Command's Civilian Casualty Assessment Team from 10 dedicated analysts to a single person. One human being responsible for tracking potential civilian harm across an entire major combat operation in one of the most densely populated and complex target environments in the modern Middle East. Congress had specifically directed the Pentagon in 2019 to establish structures to reduce civilian casualties after a series of fatal incidents in Iraq and Afghanistan. That law was not repealed. It was simply defunded and ignored. Military commands were left paying out of their own operating budgets for analysts to do work that had previously been centrally planned and resourced. The institutional muscle memory built to prevent the killing of children in schools had been stripped away, one position at a time, before the targeting list for February 28th was ever compiled. The original plan for Operation Epic Fury was presented as a precision strike campaign against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, military command structures, and IRGC leadership. It was supposed to demonstrate surgical American power, decisive and controlled. The plan assumed that the targeting data being fed into the system was current, verified, and regularly updated. It was not supposed to rely on intelligence files that had not been cross-referenced against civilian object databases in years. It was not supposed to strike buildings that had been walled off from military compounds and converted into schools for a decade. Iran had gambled that American restraint, built over decades of hard legal and institutional work, would limit civilian casualties and keep international opinion manageable. Both sides gambled wrong simultaneously. At the moment of impact on February 28th, the school building sat approximately 100 yards from an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval installation. That compound had been a lawful military target for the U.S. since the first second of the war. The school building itself had been physically part of that compound in 2013. But by September 2016 at the latest, a wall had been erected separating the school from the IRGC facility. 3 independent public entrances were built, all without military security checkpoints. The school had its own website. It was active on social media. It had hosted community events. It had been a functioning, documented civilian institution for more than a decade. The targeting officers at U.S. Central Command did not know this. They were working from Defense Intelligence Agency data that had not been updated to reflect the school's civilian status. The building still appeared in their system as part of an IRGC military compound. That was the fatal error, not an AI error, not a technology failure. A human failure rooted in an institution that had just lost 90% of its workforce dedicated to catching exactly this kind of mistake before a missile left a tube. The video of the strike emerged on Iranian social media within hours. Weapons analysts did not need days to reach conclusions. John Gilbert, senior science fellow at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in Washington, D.C., told Time magazine that the video conclusively shows a Tomahawk cruise missile diving almost vertically into the area. Sam Lair at the James Martin Center confirmed the same assessment independently. N.R. Jensen Jones, director of Armament Research Services, the technical intelligence consultancy that provides munitions analysis to governments and NGOs, told NPR, Tomahawks are only used and operated by a very small number of nations. He added, I think it's pretty clear from the emerging information that it's likely a strike that's gone wrong. While the video was being analyzed by weapons experts around the world, Pete Hegseth was standing at a podium in front of reporters and evading every direct question about the school. He said the Pentagon was investigating. He said the U.S. would never target civilian targets. He did not endorse Trump's claim that Iran did it. He did not contradict it either. He stood behind Trump physically at the press conference where Trump blamed Iran and said nothing. While Hegseth was managing the press briefings, U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dan Kane confirmed publicly at a separate Pentagon briefing on March 2nd that the U.S. Navy had fired Tomahawk missiles in southern Iran on February 28th. On March 4th, he shared a map showing U.S. and Israeli strike locations during the first 100 hours of Operation Epic Fury. Minab was on the map, the circle was in the right place, and the Secretary of Defense was still calling the investigation ongoing. On March 9th, Iranian state broadcaster ARIB published photographs of missile fragments recovered from the school site. The fragments matched known Tomahawk imagery. That same day, Trump stood before cameras and said, well, Iran or somebody else. The Tomahawk is very generic. It's sold to other countries. He then claimed Iran has Tomahawks. He said he didn't know enough about it. Iran does not have Tomahawks. Iran has never had Tomahawks. Every military analyst, every weapons scientist, and every senator who signed the letters demanding accountability knows this. Trump said it anyway. Pause. A boy waves goodbye to his mother. He goes to school. A missile with cruciform wings comes straight down. 175 people die. The president of the country that fired the missile tells the world the victim country did it, and the Secretary of Defense stands 3 feet away and says nothing. That is the sequence. Hold that before we go any further. According to a U.S. official who is not authorized to speak publicly and who was cited by NPR in its March 11th report, the preliminary findings of the Pentagon's own internal investigation had already determined that the U.S. was responsible. The investigation found that officers at U.S. Central Command used outdated data from the Defense Intelligence Agency when it included the school building on its target list. The school's civilian status, established and physically evident since at least 2016, had not been reflected in the targeting package. The official confirmed that Hegseth's decision to cut civilian casualty assessment capacity down to one analyst at CENTCOM was a direct contributing factor to the failure. Military commands were, at the time of targeting, paying out of their own budgets for civilian harm analysis because the dedicated infrastructure no longer existed. Former military officials speaking to Semaphore in the aftermath of the strike confirmed the pattern of institutional failure. Humans, not AI, are to blame for the school strike, those officials said, pointing specifically to stale human-curated data fed into the Pentagon's Maven targeting platform. The artificial intelligence had processed the data it was given. The data it was given was wrong. The problem was not the machine. The problem was the system of human oversight that was supposed to catch exactly this kind of error and had been systematically defunded and dismantled in the months before the war began. On March 11, 2026, the letter from senators landed on Hegseth's desk. It was led by Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, with Senators Jeanne Shaheen, Chris Van Hollen, Tim Kaine, Elizabeth Warren, and Brian Schatz, and signed by 41 senators covering virtually the entire Democratic caucus and both independent senators, Bernie Sanders and Angus King. The letter asked Hegseth more than a dozen specific questions. What was the intended target? At what command level was authorization granted? Were AI tools used? What was the civilian harm assessment conducted before the strike? Was a no-strike list consulted? The senators set a deadline of May 4th for answers. As of this broadcast, the Pentagon has provided none of them. The letter also called out Hegseth's public statements directly. On March 3rd, you said that Operation Epic Fury would have no stupid rules of engagement. On March 4th, you said there will be death and destruction from the sky all day long. This rhetoric only serves to endanger civilians. The words came not from anti-war activists or foreign governments. They came from 41 sitting U.S. senators with security clearances, writing to the man responsible for the conduct of the operation. House Democrats went further in mid-April and introduced articles of impeachment against Hegseth, citing unauthorized military action, violations of the law of armed conflict, and mishandling of classified information. Impeachment requires a House majority and a two-thirds Senate vote. The numbers do not exist. But the formal introduction of impeachment articles against a sitting defense secretary over allegations of war crimes in an active conflict is not a procedural routine. That has not happened before in modern American military history. Why does this matter beyond the tragedy of a single strike? Follow the institutional destruction, because that is where the real story lives. Pete Hegseth did not walk into the Pentagon and announce that he was going to enable the killing of school children. What he announced was a philosophy, maximum lethality. What he implemented was a staffing decision, cut the Civilian Protection Office by 90%. What he created was a system where the single most important safeguard against killing civilians in a densely populated conflict environment, a dedicated team of analysts whose job was to check targeting data against civilian object databases before the missile leaves the tube, had been reduced to one person, one analyst, one person standing between every airstrike and a potential war crime. This shifts the accountability structure in a way that has profound legal implications. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and multiple UN Special Rapporteurs have called for an independent investigation. They used a specific phrase: self-investigation by the responsible party is insufficient when the scale of civilian casualties is this large. International humanitarian law requires parties to the conflict to distinguish at all times between combatants and military objectives and civilian objects. It is not enough to say you did not intend to hit a school if the failure to verify that the building was a school resulted from the deliberate dismantlement of the system designed to verify exactly that. Over 100 international legal scholars, including Yale Law School professors Una Hathaway and Harold Koh, Philip Alston of NYU, and former Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth published a joint letter condemning the strikes on Iran, with the Minab school attack listed as the primary example of what they called possible war crimes. Their specific language was precise. The strike is among the deadliest single attacks by the U.S. military on civilians in recent decades. They noted that Hegseth's stated philosophy of maximum lethality over tepid legality had created conditions in which this kind of killing becomes not an accident, but a predictable outcome. And they wrote that accountability has been notably absent, and that its absence only allows conduct to grow more aggressive and reckless. The war is currently costing U.S. taxpayers up to $2 billion per day. The Pentagon investigation into the Minab strike is formally open. It has been open for 2 months. Its preliminary findings, per the New York Times, already point to U.S. responsibility. The final report has not been released. The senators' questions have not been answered. And the President of the United States has told the public on camera that Iran did it. Here is the domino structure of consequences now in motion. If the Pentagon's final investigation confirms U.S. responsibility, and every piece of preliminary evidence already points in that direction, then the United States will have confirmed that it killed more than 100 children in a school on the first morning of a war. If that confirmation arrives without simultaneous accountability for the institutional failures that made it possible, including Hegseth's gutting of civilian protection infrastructure, then every future U.S. military operation runs with those same reduced safeguards. If those same reduced safeguards are in place during future operations, what happened in Minab is not a one-time failure. It is a new operating standard. The geopolitical watchers calculating this are not just America's adversaries, they are America's allies. Australia's foreign minister, Germany's chancellor, France, the UK, nations that coordinate targeting intelligence with the United States, are now looking at the Minab evidence and asking a question that nobody in Washington wants to answer publicly. If U.S. targeting data can be a decade out of date on a building that has been a school with a website and social media accounts, what else is on those target lists that has not been verified? The abandonment of accountability is perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story. Marco Rubio has said the U.S. would not deliberately target civilians. Senator John Kennedy, a Republican, told reporters, "We would never do that intentionally. I'm sorry, it was a mistake." But a mistake made possible by the systematic removal of the systems designed to catch that exact mistake is not simply a mistake. It is a policy outcome. And no one in the administration has yet accepted that distinction. Inside the American political structure, the fracture over this issue is deepening in ways that will not close by the time the war ends. The Democratic caucus is near unanimous in demanding answers. A small but notable number of Republican senators, including Susan Collins and Tom Tillis, have signaled discomfort with the administration's posture on international law without crossing into open confrontation. The war's $2 billion daily price tag is generating its own pressure from fiscal conservatives who saw this as a limited operation and are watching it extend without a clear endpoint. The institutional fractures inside Congress over the school strike and the conduct of the war more broadly are building below the surface of a partisan political reality that makes them difficult to express publicly. Inside Iran, the Minab massacre has done something that no Iranian government statement could have achieved on its own. It has produced solidarity between Iranian people who hate their own government and the international community's concern about what is being done to them. The Iranian government exploited the grief politically, forcing families from the Sunni Baluchi minority whose children died in the school to participate in a Shia mass funeral ceremony that did not accord with their religious traditions. But the grief underneath the exploitation is real. Those rows of graves visible in satellite imagery of the local cemetery, those children's names matching ages and identifying information on body bags that Human Rights Watch researchers reviewed. That is the foundation of what happened in Minab, and no political framing on either side erases it. The pink flowers and green leaves painted on the outside of the Shajareh Tayyebeh School are not just a detail for a news story. They are the symbol of everything that went wrong and everything that continues to go wrong. They represent a building that announced its purpose in the most visible possible way, that had separated itself from the military compound next door nearly a decade before the missile came, that had a website and a social media page and children inside it at 10 in the morning, and that still ended up on a targeting list because the one system that existed to catch that error had been reduced to a single overloaded analyst. You can announce maximum lethality as your military philosophy, but you cannot unkill a classroom. You can call a Tomahawk missile very generic on camera, but you cannot make Iran capable of firing weapons it has never possessed. You can investigate yourself, but you cannot satisfy international law's requirement for independent accountability when your own preliminary findings already show your forces were responsible. Reality does not negotiate with press briefing language. Reality has rows of graves that are measurable from satellite imagery. So where does this stand right now, on this morning? The Pentagon investigation is open and unanswered. 41 U.S. senators are still waiting for responses to questions that have a May 4th deadline. Articles of impeachment against the Secretary of Defense are formally before the House. Over 100 of the world's most respected international legal scholars have called the strike a possible war crime in writing. The preliminary findings of the Pentagon's own internal investigation, reported by the New York Times, point to U.S. responsibility. The final report has not been released, and the president has not changed his public statement that Iran did it. Watch for three things in the coming days: whether the Pentagon releases any portion of its investigation before the senator's May 4th deadline, because silence after that date becomes its own statement; whether any Republican senator breaks ranks and formally demands a public accounting, because that is the threshold at which this becomes a bipartisan crisis rather than a partisan argument; and whether the International Criminal Court's preliminary examinations, already open on conduct in the broader conflict, expand in scope in a direction that includes the Minab targeting failure in their formal review. Subscribe. We are tracking the Pentagon's investigation deadline, every congressional development on this story, and every international legal action connected to civilian casualties in this war. When the final report drops or the senators go public with a formal response, we cover it the moment it happens. Stay sharp. A classroom was painted with pink flowers. The truth about what happened to it is still being hidden, and the hiding itself is part of the story.